Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Nicholas Logothetis, co-founder and chairman of the board, Concordia, and Matthew Swift, co-founder, chairman, and CEO, Concordia.
Good morning. Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back for day 2 of the 2016 Concordia Summit. It's wonderful to see so many of you back for another day of robust dialogue on the power of partnerships in addressing today's global problems. Yesterday, we heard from many preeminent thought leaders on issues ranging from education to cancer research to labor trafficking to a humane and global food supply. I was honored to host a discussion on the state of American politics along my good friend Morgan Ortagus with Senators Perdue, Heitkamp, Graham, and Mitchell. The coming year will decide the future role of the United States in the world, and there's no better time than now to be discussing what that might look like. Today, we'll further explore the potential of a Pan-American energy alliance after having heard from T. Boone Pickens yesterday in a conversation with Tom Brokaw. We'll also delve into security challenges in the digital age and how partnerships can help establish a platform to address international security concerns. And now, my friend Nick.
Beyond that, we'll also bring the private sector voice to discussions prevalent in the international community, namely on ways to achieve the UN Sustainable Development Goals and how to solve the ongoing refugee crisis. Multilateral actors and international governments can only address these pressing problems working in tandem with business, corporations, and private sector enterprises. Concordia is proud to provide a nonpartisan, cross-sector platform for these different actors to convene, especially to explore the changing role of business in society. So with that, it is my great pleasure to introduce my friend Gregory Maniatis. He is the senior advisor to Peter Sutherland, the UN Special Representative for Migration, senior program advisor at the Open Society Foundations, and is also affiliated with Columbia University's Global Policy Initiative. So welcome, Gregory.
Good morning, everyone. I am stepping in for Peter Sutherland, who has taken ill and can't be with us tonight. It's very hard to replace Peter. It's an almost impossible task. He is the driving force or a driving force behind the 2 UN summits that are taking place down the road. And I've worked with him for 11 years, very fruitful years for me, I think, and for migration, as he has served as Special Representative of the Secretary General for Migration. Peter would have been your ideal host in terms of what we're trying to accomplish here. He bridges worlds. He is a CEO. He is the president of the International Catholic Charities that are dedicated to migration. He is a politician par excellence and the founder of the World Trade Organization, the founding director of the World Trade Organization. We miss his presence here today and all week. I couldn't open today's summit without thanking Nick Logothetis and Matt Swift, who are the founders of Concordia, and Regina Hubbard Sheridan, who runs the show here. They have been the most generous, professional, and ambitious of hosts for us here. And I also need to thank our co-organizers of the event, the UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR, the International Organization for Migration, and especially the Columbia Global Policy Initiative, as well as the sponsors of today's private sector summit on refugees and migrants, the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation, and the Open Society Foundations. We, I think, are obliged to begin the day with a fairly solemn recognition, which is that a humanitarian challenge that began almost 2 years ago has spun out of control. It's now an acute political crisis that in part helped lead to Brexit, that is undermining our democracies, and that has echoes of far darker times in the past, echoes which we have to ensure do not become portents. It is, in other words, one of those fairly rare crossroads in history when we as individuals cannot assume that others, politicians, governments, international organizations, are the ones who are going to quell the danger. Each of us has the responsibility now to act. So today's private sector summit on refugees and migration began with a conversation last December. A small group of us were really quite distressed with the fearful and often shameful reaction of governments to the crisis in the Mediterranean. And that stood in stark contrast to the many acts of individual heroism that we saw every day, not least from those who were risking their lives to cross the Mediterranean and have a chance at an existence for themselves and their children that was better, but also by individuals who, despite the failure of governments to act, stood up and took their time and their resources to help refugees. On the Greek islands, 50,000 individuals on their own, with their own resources, came to volunteer to help. Thousands of NGOs and businesses did the same. So it's this wellspring of compassion and this entrepreneurialism that we're trying to capture with this summit, to try to capture and promote what all of us should be doing. We felt that a gathering like this, taking place down the road from 2 UN summits, one hosted by the Secretary General, the other one hosted by President Obama, could send a signal to the 150 heads of state who are gathered there. 3 signals. First of all, that the private sector has the capacity to help resolve the crisis. It has the resources and the innovative spirit to help do that. Second, that private sector leaders expect their heads of state, their prime ministers and their governments to bring order to this chaos in a way that is generous and humane. And third, that the time has come to end a failed system wherein we warehouse refugees in camps, often for decades, and to create a new model that allows them to work and integrate into our communities. That's the goal that we have here today. We see our summit today as the start of a conversation. We've chosen a handful of topics. We could have chosen another 24. We could have spoken about each of them for 2 or 3 hours, so we're quite limited in what we can do today. But we expect this to end with a determined call to action, not merely a set of workshops. We hope by the end of the day that we'll be able to present to you a clear set of ideas about what all of us can do to address one of the defining issues of the 21st century. And our day has gone up to a great start. George Soros, who will be with us shortly, has announced that he will invest up to $500 million of his own private capital in businesses, startups, enterprises owned by migrants and refugees, larger businesses that address challenges related to refugees and migration. And we'll hear a little bit more about that in about 45 minutes. Reserve that for him. He'll be here shortly. So now I want to introduce Michael Doyle, who has been an incredible partner, supportive of Peter's work over the years and of mine, who is going to lead a star-studded opening plenary session. Michael is a professor at the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University, and he is the director of Columbia's Global Policy Initiative. But he also has another identity for those of us who work in migration. He worked with Kofi Annan 15 years ago when Kofi tried to make migration a larger part of the UN agenda. Michael was spearheading those efforts. I welcome Michael to the floor. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Over the horizon, she's smooth sailing. It's kind of easy. Now she headed east down the boulevard. Said I like the way.
Thank you, Gregory, for those warm words and that inspiring introduction. Like you, I could not begin this session except by expressing my gratitude and admiration to Peter Sutherland, who has done so much over the years in both helping to create these summits and this private sector summit, and over 10 years being such a powerful voice for refugees and migrants. It is a true pleasure to regard him as a friend and as a leader. And Peter, I hope that if not now, but in the near future, you will hear this streamed and think that we lived up to your passions and your commitment in the cause of refugees and migrants. Thus, it's on behalf of Peter and Columbia's Global Policy Initiative that I'm very pleased to welcome you to this discussion of the state of human mobility. With 244 million migrants in the world, the fifth most populous nation, just below Indonesia, just above Brazil. And unfortunately, because of persecution, but fortunately because of rescue, with 21 million plus refugees and 3 million plus asylum seekers, this is a world of people who require and deserve our attention and support. Fortunately, we could have no better guides to understanding this world of mobility than my colleagues here on the panel this morning. I'll first turn to the two co-sponsors of this event, UNHCR and IOM. High Commissioner Filippo Grandi, to my immediate right, who has had a distinguished career in UNHCR and is now the 11th High Commissioner of UNHCR. I'll then turn to Director General Bill Swing of the International Organization for Migration, a distinguished U.S. diplomat who's also served 5 years in peacekeeping and has just now led IOM into the UN system. Bill, welcome to the promised land. There have been many Moses and Aarons out there. I know your religious background. You are the Joshua that brought IOM to the promised land. A peaceable Joshua we need to add on top of that. I will then turn to David Miliband, the inspiring leader of the International Rescue Committee, who will talk about the global condition and situation, the humanitarian crisis we're in today. Then to Mayor Giorgos Kaminis of Athens for the local engagement with refugees and vulnerable migrants based upon the experiences of his town and its generous attitude and actions towards refugees. And then to the distinguished Mr. Meb Keflezighi, the champion of the Boston Marathon, many of us have seen him, and the silver medalist of the US Olympics, who was once a refugee and has proved how, with assistance, one can create a life of extraordinary achievement. So welcome to you, Meb. And then lastly, but not leastly, my friend Karen Abuzayd, who has done so much to plan the UN summit and has given us a way forward, a light that the UN community will hopefully take up and deliver upon. So welcome to you all. Our time is very short, and so each of our participants will be speaking for 3 or 4 minutes, and then time allowing, we'll take some questions that will, I gather, be electronically transmitted to me up here if we can allow so. So, Mr. Grandi, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good morning. Let me just share literally a few thoughts. First, you've heard already, I think, I couldn't hear all the introduction earlier, but you've heard about the size of the problem. 65 million refugees and displaced people, meaning refugees in their own country, mostly displaced by conflict and other forms of violence or persecution and discrimination. Many of these causes pretty intractable and difficult to resolve. Very little appetite worldwide for making peace, and increasing movements of people to countries near conflict, but even beyond those countries into the industrialized world. This has generated a backlash, which is not always very nice to see. So a negative context. There's what to do. I'm often asked, so what do we do about that? But the first thing, rhetorical as it may sound, is to continue to remind governments, those that have a say in these matters, that peace needs to be pursued, that conflicts have to end. It's never not useful to do that. And meanwhile, of course, I think it is very important to remember that 90% perhaps of those 65 million people are not in the rich world. They are in countries that are neighboring conflicts, most of them countries, developing countries, poor countries, middle-income countries. And that the biggest burden of the responsibility for these people is on those countries and on the communities that are hosting refugees and displaced people. Yesterday, as was already mentioned, just a few blocks away, we had the first ever United Nations Summit on refugees and migrants, and I'm sure my colleagues will speak more about that. You know, there's been a lot of, we've had a lot of questions about this summit. And while the summit happened, I'm sure you followed the news, we had a bloody attack on a humanitarian convoy in Syria with many people killed from the local Red Crescent Society. We had a fire in an island in Greece that displaced further refugees that have been there for several months. So many, including ourselves, ask, what are we doing here in New York talking while this is going on? Well, I think, my concluding point here is that it is important to remember what is written clearly in the preamble of the Refugee Convention, the most important document that governs international protection of refugees. It stipulates clearly that refugees are an international responsibility. And I think that what the summit wanted to do yesterday, and every state committed to it, is to share that responsibility more. We'll work with states to make that practical. And there's many ways that the summit itself elaborated, proposed, agreed upon, very practical ways. But I think that one important shareholder in that responsibility is business, is the private sector that you represent here. First of all, as philanthropists, giving money, giving resources, because that is needed, but also creating awareness within your own companies, in your own communities about this cause. And of course, I think very importantly, increasingly important, telling us, helping us, organizations, international organizations, be more innovative. We're not very good at that. We're big bureaucracies. We have a lot of rules. We have a lot of constraints. So we need to learn from you to be more agile, more practical, more cost-effective, more results-oriented. I just want to end with two caveats or two points that clarifies issues that sometimes are not entirely clear. Refugees, we always talk about refugees as people in camps. Most refugees are not in camps. 70, 80, maybe 90% are not in camps. They live in communities. So it is important to think of supporting refugees as supporting whole communities, including those that host them. I think it's very important. And most of these people are in cities, not even in rural areas. So that is interesting for people from business that want to help them. And second, there's how many times have you heard, have we said, refugees are not a burden, they are contributors. It's absolutely true. We must look at them as contributing actors. But remember, many are very vulnerable people, and many need very specific support because they're vulnerable in order to turn that vulnerability into a strength and an asset. Thank you.
Filippo, thank you very much for those words, including your invitation to this group to propose ideas that UNHCR might find valuable, and your challenge to them to support refugees around the world. So thank you very much. I'll turn to Bill right now. Okay.
Good morning. It's an honor to be with you and with my distinguished colleagues here. We are in the middle of a perfect storm, and we need your help. Filippo has already outlined some of the storm. We have an unprecedented series of simultaneous, complex, and protracted emergencies, humanitarian emergencies and crises, stretching from the western bulge of Africa into the Himalayas. There are at least 8 or 9. I won't name them, the biggest of all, of course, being Syria. We as an international community have done a very poor job of preventing these conflicts, and if possible, we've done an even worse job of resolving them. I'm not aware of any negotiations right now that offer any promise of a short to medium-term solution of any of these. More people on the move than ever before, as Filippo said, 65 million uprooted, another 75 million living 1 meter above sea level, and we have a world that is somewhat indifferent to all of this. So we really need your help. We have, in addition, growing and widespread anti-migrant sentiment that becomes almost anti-foreign sentiment. We have very little political courage or leadership on most of these questions involving people on the move, refugees and other non-refugee migrants. So we really are in great need here. We have also a serious erosion of international moral authority in terms of the kind of support we're getting on some of these issues. And we have a violation of international humanitarian law on all sides, including this latest bombing of the convoy going into Syria with aid. We have 200 people inside Syria doing nothing but looking after people who are uprooted, and the same is true for all of our other colleagues here who have people in the field. So my second point would be, it's a confessional moment. We have not engaged the private sector as much as we should have. You are our natural partners. We need your help in trying to turn around a very toxic narrative that basically has the cruel irony of making out of people who are fleeing terrorists actually terrorists or criminals. And we need to turn that toxic narrative around. Secondly, we need your help in trying to help people to understand again that there is a great virtue in diversity. This great city was built on the backs of migrants and with their brains, and continues to be so. If you took all the migrants out of New York City, they'd probably be the 3rd or 4th largest city in the United States. So we need to get back to a narrative that is much more historically correct, and that will help us then with the whole question of diversity. I'll leave you with one thought. We have no choice. Migration is not an issue to be solved. It is a human reality that all of us, all of society, all of the governments and international organizations, that we need to manage, and we need to do it humanely and responsibly. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bill. I think the point that you're making, that migration is real, it's a part of all of our lives. I could just ask everyone in the room here who has worked sometime in their lives in a country they weren't born in to raise their hand. It's so dark I wouldn't see them, so I will not do that, but I suspect 3/4 of this room, if not more, would be raising their hand. This is the world we live in. It needs to be supported and encouraged. So thank you for those words, Bill. I now turn to David Miliband.
Well, look, the two speakers, Filippo and Bill, I think have done a brilliant job in setting out the contours of the challenge, which is that we're playing catch up with a set of issues that are genuinely global and which are long-term, not short-term. And too much of the debate in the humanitarian sector is about short-term solutions, and I think what this audience can engage in is longer-term solutions. I run an organization which is both an international humanitarian aid organization in war zones, fragile states, and on transit routes, so in Syria and Afghanistan, in Somalia, but also in the neighboring states and on the transit routes. And we're a refugee resettlement agency in the United States in 29 US cities, settling 12,000 refugees a year. And I want to focus on the refugee side of this question, the people who are fleeing with a quote-unquote well-founded fear of persecution. It's not that refugees are good and migrants are bad, but they're different. Refugees have rights in international law. States have responsibilities to them that are different from those rights of migrants and the responsibilities towards them. And I think in 3 areas, there needs to be a new deal, and this audience has got to be part of it. The first is that no one has any excuse for saying that this is a global problem that isn't close to them. If you're in American business in any town or city, whether it be Boise, Idaho, or Las Vegas, or Los Angeles, or New York, refugees are being resettled. And those refugees don't just need the help of the state, They don't just need the help of NGOs, they need mentors, volunteers, employment opportunities. And so in every community around this country, and frankly around other countries around the world, the private sector can be part of the solution, or it can stand to one side. And I think that my appeal to you would be to engage locally. The second point, and really this is in ascending order of difficulty, the resettlement of refugees is not just the right thing to do, it's also a practical thing to do, because it's been proven over many years in this country, as Bill and Filippo have alluded. Secondly, we have a challenge, but I think far from an insuperable one, of doing a far better job of running the humanitarian aid system in states that are peaceful but have received a lot of refugees. Those states are countries like Lebanon and Jordan, but they're also like countries like Kenya and Ethiopia. And in those places, the short-termism of the humanitarian aid system has not just let down the refugees, it's let down the local communities. So when I tell you that less than 2% of the global humanitarian aid budget goes on education, you can see how short-termism has a real cost. 200,000 Syrian kids in Lebanon are not getting an education. Frankly, there's no excuse for that. Lebanon is a relatively peaceful country. One couldn't have said that 30 years ago. The Lebanese government has committed a second shift for 200,000 kids who are getting some form of education. But the short-termism of the system means that there isn't proper education for those 200,000 other kids. And that failure in respect of education, you could say the same about employment, where there's been a vicious circle between international engagement and local restrictions, has frankly shortchanged the refugees, but it's also shortchanged the societies in which they are living. One interesting point, at a time when there's a lot of talk of tension between refugees and host communities, we did a study in Lebanon which showed that for every dollar of cash that went to refugees, $2.13 circulated in the local economy. A real win-win. The third element, I think probably seems a long way from the private sector, but actually you've got a role to play. And that is in the war zones themselves. For those people who are not yet refugees, there are 17 million people still in Syria, just to take that as an example. And you might think, well, that doesn't sound like an investment opportunity for any of us. But different parts of the private sector are playing a role in all of the war zones in which we're working. Let me just give you one example. Western Union, 90% of its customers are sending remittances back to people who are living in war zones. I'm not here to advertise for Western Union, but as it happens, they offered zero rate charges for people who are sending back money to certain places. So the third level of the challenge is for all of us to do a better job, even those of us who are not working on the politics or on the military side, in assuaging or improving the conditions of people who are caught up in conflict, the innocent victims of conflict. And so my feeling about this week is that it's a time to say there are no more excuses for any of us, whether we're in the public sector, the private sector, or the voluntary sector, in stepping up to this global challenge, because it is one which, even if we're not interested in refugees, they're going to be interested in us, and it's time that the world took notice.
Thank you, David, for those remarks, especially to encourage us to look over the horizon for the long-run consequences of not acting now in ways that, if we fail to act, do not recognize the rights of refugees and migrants, and equally importantly, don't take advantage of their productivity in ways that they could do so much for everyone. This is a win-win, as you say. I now turn to Mayor Kaminis, who is very much at the front lines for assistance to refugees and vulnerable migrants. Mayor, would you share some words with us?
Well, thank you. Good morning to everyone. I'm going to consecrate my intervention to the refugee issue. Well, you know that late July 2015, thousands of refugees started arriving massively to the islands of Greece, and from there to Athens. For a year, we have had 900,000 people passing through Athens and going to the north in order to cross the border, going to other European countries. When the border closed, we had, and we still have, around 60,000 people stuck in Greece. Now, there is a relocation program launched by the European Union that's not going very well. We have only had 3,000 people being relocated, while the program provides for 160,000 refugees living in Italy and Greece to be relocated. Unfortunately, that's not the case. Anyway, our first the first thing that we had to do was to offer emergency relief. So immediately the city of Athens created a refugee camp. We twice expanded this camp. Now it hosts 2,500 refugees, and a total of 15,000 refugees in the region of Athens. And at the same time, we work together with the United Nations Commissioner for Refugees, and we participate in this relocation scheme program, renting apartments for refugees. We have rented 200 apartments, and we are hosting 1,200 people. Now, we are speaking about a crisis within a crisis, because you know that Greece is going through a very severe financial crisis. It's the 7th consecutive year of recession. So we have to be inventive. We have to do things another way with less means and provide shelter for more people. So what we had to do was to invent other ways of working, creating mostly synergies. Synergies, first of all, with the society, with the civil society, working closely together with NGOs, some of them internationally very active, like IRC, like Mercy Corps, and creating solidarity networks among cities, not only in Greece, but only in Europe. We launched a program of solidarity network cities in Europe. It was last April in the European Summit of Capital Cities of Europe, and we created this network. It was on the proposition of Athens. Now we have major cities in Europe like Barcelona, like Amsterdam, Madrid, who are willing to receive refugees. So you see cities are cooperating, cities are more open, while governments are very close and very negative. And that is an important thing to think about, because cities are now the drivers of growth, of innovation. And cities are more reactive and can work closer with their citizens. And of course, with the private sector. Now, the private sector. First of all, we are working together with the private sector through donations, with the Stavros Niarchos Foundation, with the Open Society Foundation, and through the NGOs, we work together with the donors of the NGOs who find some opportunities to invest in Athens in refugee programs. And we also have our programs where we integrate refugees. We have an open school program, schools open in the afternoon for the neighborhood, where one of the things that we do is offer Greek language courses to refugee children. And finally, I have spoken to David Miliband. I'm looking a way to finance a program where in neighborhoods where mostly refugees go, to create incentives for young Greek students to come. We have many empty apartments in some neighborhoods in Athens. There is an experience here in New York after 9/11. Lower Manhattan started having losses in its population. People were leaving Lower Manhattan. The city of New York created a program through some incentives, financial incentives, attracting young people to Lower Manhattan. That's what we are trying to do in Athens. Unfortunately, the European funding programs for refugees provide only for refugees as direct recipients, while there could be indirect recipients when you have in those neighborhoods where unfortunately we had the Golden Dawn, this right-wing extreme party ravaging in those neighborhoods, bringing young people. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Your remarks bring home to me a phrase that Peter Sutherland often uses. Responsibility is global. It's an international responsibility, but the principle seems to be propinquity. Those nearest to the conflicts bear the burdens. And it's very heartening to see ways in which Athens has stepped up in that regard, but it's a message to the rest of us that solidarity with you and your city is essential. Meb, the floor is yours.
Good morning. It's a great honor to be here. I was born in Eritrea. I'm sure most of you know where Eritrea is. My dad has to walk 225 miles to save his life because he was wanted by the Ethiopian soldiers. He made to Sudan, but the biggest journey that he was leaving behind was a wife and 5 kids. Once he got to Sudan, he got 2 different jobs, worked his way to Italy, But at home was very difficult. No education opportunities and no electricity. You have to do a lot of chores. But my dad made it to Italy. Once he made it to Italy, Dr. Michael Tawalde and his boss helped him get assimilated to the Italian culture. In Italy, he worked as a janitor and landscaper to accumulate enough money. But one day, he asked his boss to loan him money. 10 million lira in 1986, that's about 6,000 US dollars. My dad asked him for a loan. He said, come back in a few days, and Dr. Brindisi, his boss, and Dr. Michael's boss said, this is not a loan, it's a gift. So there are a lot of good people in the world and a lot of great countries that help refugees. Once we came to Italy, he sponsored us. I remember going to Athens, Greece, meeting him there after 5 years of separation. I ran into him, and he goes, Marhawi, which is 4 years younger brother than me. He expects me to be much more bigger. But, my mom traveled for the first time, too, on the plane, and she just says, my dad was in tears because his kids were so small that he didn't have enough food and all those things. And he says, don't cry about the sizes, make sure they're all here. So there's a lot of frustration when you come to a new land and difficulties. But we worked hard because we wanted chance and opportunities. And when we came to the United States in 1987, I remember it was like yesterday, to get a better educational opportunities. That's what my parents wanted. You might know about my story about running, but all my siblings have gotten college degrees and try to be a positive contributors to the society. Not that they know that, could be a doctor or engineer or MBA or a runner or Stanford graduate and things like that. But if you place people in opportunities and assimilate to the country, and there are so many generous people, whether it's in Italy, in Athens, or in the United States, that help us be the best human being that we can be. Yes, we start at the bottom of the floor, but we worked our way up to be able to be a positive contributors. I am honored to be here to share my story that there are good people in the world, and thank you for bringing awareness to the refugees and immigrants.
Thank you, Meb, for that story. You're an inspiration in the sense that you're the model of what, in the highest possible way, a refugee can become. Now, not every refugee is going to be an Olympic champion, but they all have a contribution to make, and even if yours is the most, perhaps, striking of them all. So thank you for those words. Karen, a tough act to follow, but please wrap us up.
That's not fair. But this is the reason why we say everyone should meet a refugee, and then your mind is completely changed and you have a different approach to perhaps the negative feelings you had before. I'm very happy to be here one day after 193 member states have formally signed up to the New York Declaration on Refugees and Migrants. We think it's a pretty big achievement in this time of political tensions and other things, and the negative narrative that is out there about refugees and migrants. So we applaud the member states on this. We do count on the private sector. I would say it's already been mentioned about your creative energy, and that you have to show member states how to help meet these commitments they've made. I would like to tell you about some of them so that maybe you know where you might fit in to convince your leaders, your political leaders, to do something. One is on education. And that is, there's the first time there's been a time-bound goal of putting refugee children into education within a few months. Some of us wanted a few days, but of course that wasn't realistic, so it's now a few months. We have policies related to the integration and inclusion of refugees, and I'll see that from the other speakers and other things that will come up, is making sure that when someone comes into a country, that they learn the language, that they get a job, that they're allowed to work, they're allowed to move around, they're getting into education if they need it. And this is another place where we think the private sector can be very helpful. We also think there needs to be help of helping those. We say no state can do this alone, even small states or small numbers of refugees, and certainly with large numbers. So the states have to work together as a collective. And everybody is on this. Our slogan in our anti-xenophobia campaign, which is to help some of this narrative, says, together, respect, safety, and dignity for all. And these are things that we think can help very much. So we know that the private sector talks about their diverse workforces being really economically sound and so on, and they can give these messages out, I think, to the public and tell them that you're on the side of the refugees and welcoming them and so on. So I think there's a lot of work to be done to make these commitments be fulfilled, to make sure the states live up to these commitments on money and on resettlement places and also on jobs and scholarships for people who come to their country, or jobs in education at least. So I think the summit is a milestone, but it's really important what comes next, and we need all of you helping us move that forward with the leaders in each country.
Thank you so much. So much, Karen. You've set out marching orders for the international community and the work that the member states did yesterday. It's a huge challenge, and it wouldn't have happened without your very careful work of you and your team in putting that together. So thank you very much. All the panelists have sort of stayed on schedule. It's really quite remarkable. It shows how good a team that they really are. That leaves us some time for a question that's come from you all, and it's a very tough question. In our last couple minutes, I'd like to see if someone would like to volunteer to tackle it. The question is, with so much of the current attention in the world focused on Syria, how can we make sure that the other refugee crises around the world get adequate attention so that their interests are also placed on the international agenda in the ways that they need to be? The vast majority of the refugees we know today in the world are not in Syria. And how can we make sure that attention is paid to them? What can be done to make sure that that happens? Anyone care to jump in?
I mean, I can
Maybe
speak
David and
from
Filippo.
the sharp end of this, because we know that there are 2.2 million internally displaced people in northeast Nigeria who we need to serve. We know there are 3,000 Afghan villages where we work that's a continuing challenge. We know that the situation in Myanmar deserves and demands attention. And the best answer, I think, how can we make a difference, is that in all our decisions, even at the margin, that you give the marginal dollar to make sure, or the marginal amount of time, or the marginal effort to make sure those people aren't forgotten. And I think it's a responsibility that we can all fulfill in different ways according to our mandates. But I think that it's not just a matter of saying that we need to ask world leaders to act differently. We've got to make our own decisions. Because even for the European refugee crisis, it's 50% Syrian, but it's 25% Afghan. Yeah. And so I think it's important to say that we can't afford to chase the headlines. You've actually got to serve the people. And that's something that I think everyone can make a contribution to. Yeah.
Let me turn to Filippo, then I'm going to try to squeeze in one more question that I'm going to start with Bill on, if I could.
I just want to, I agree with David, but on top of that, even Syria was not very much paid attention to until the Syrians arrived in Europe. I think we should not wait till refugees from South Sudan or from other countries in Africa reach rich countries to pay attention to them. And then I agree, we need to act first. I have one thing to say, in some of those countries that are less in the limelight, I was in Uganda, I mentioned this at the summit yesterday. Actually, the policies of the governments, the attitude of the local community are pretty extraordinary in terms of receiving people, sharing land, giving them opportunities. I think that these are very interesting situations in which people like you can contribute because the context is favorable. There is cooperation, there is solidarity. So that's, if at all, that may be an incentive to look at situations that are less in the limelight.
I'm going to take one last question in our last minute, and this is a very interesting question. How can we shift public opinion to the understanding that's expressed amongst all of us here to have a better appreciation for what refugees and migrants can do in our communities? This is something that Bill mentioned in his intervention, so I might turn to him first. Bill, do you have some quick words on this difficult problem?
Thank you, Michael. No, I think first of all, clearly we're not doing a very good job of telling the story. This is, again, where the business community, the private sector, and civil service, civil society together can help us a lot. We need to get out there the story of the contributions that migrants are making. We also need to tell the story better. For example, we've never given adequate publicity to the fact that The 6 neighbors of Libya, the 4 neighbors of Syria to this day have kept their borders open to protect people coming across. This stands in contrast to those who want to put up fences and build walls and block people out. That story needs to be told much better than it has been up to now. That would be my main recommendation. I think beyond that, we need also to let people know that countries like Ethiopia, they've been host to 700,000 refugees for many, many years, 600,000 in Kenya, 200,000 in Sudan. Lebanon, with a population of 5 million, has 1.5 million Syrians plus 500,000 Palestinians. These are the stories that need to be told. When I left the Central African Republic on my last visit, I told the president, I said, look, your biggest problem may not be the one you think it is. Your problem is, how do you keep yourself in the headlines? Very difficult to do, and there we need the media.
Great. I've heard a rumor that George Soros would like to make an important announcement in a couple of minutes. So I want to thank the panelists. Please join me in thanking them for these inspiring words.
He's still running. Yeah, in Rio. And then I got 2 more minutes.